relevant, reliable, and researched. This is Experts on Call, the show focused on delivering leading-edge news and information on today's most beneficial products and services. This is Experts on Call on AM 650.
I was going to say welcome back to Key Pacific's Talk About Strata, but I wasn't going to try talking over that. Our musical director, Tony Giventu, executive director of the Condominium Homeowners Association of British Columbia, chose a particular... Was that Megadeth?
Yeah.
Well, at least I recognize the band. What was that all about?
Noise.
Noise. Oh, brother.
Yeah, music to some ears, but noise to others.
Absolutely. I'm Sterling Fox. Tony Giventu is my co-host, and our guest tonight is Stephen Hamilton, a strata lawyer and partner in Hammerberg Lawyers here in Vancouver. Noise. You, the lawyer, deal with a lot of nuisance complaints, and there's been a story, it's been very prominent in the papers around town this week about a couple who lodged a noise complaint against their next-door neighbor in a strata environment, Stephen. The kid had a piano and used to practice, and the neighbors claimed that the practicing of the piano was an intrusion into the privacy and quiet of their lives. How did that work out?
Well, the way I understand that particular case worked out is the court, the judge who had to decide the case, concluded that the owners who were complaining that the piano playing was a nuisance had not proven their claim, and it was dismissed. So at the end of the day, presumably, the boy gets to continue to play his piano.
But in the course of, to the credit at least of the parent of the piano-playing offender,
yes,
they had, the neighbors who were complaining had gone and knocked on his door, and he had attempted to mitigate the noise in some way, practicing only specific hours during the day and damping down the piano with the cloth covers or whatever. He had attempted to appease the neighbors to some extent.
It appears that's the case, that the owner who had the son that was playing the piano, they took a number of remedial steps to lessen the nuisance. But at the end of the day, it didn't satisfy the owner beside them. And that's the difficulty with nuisance cases. What may be a nuisance to one person may not be a nuisance to another person. And It becomes very difficult for strata councils to deal with these kinds of complaints. And they are frequent, they are common, they are probably one of the more challenging areas for strata councils to deal with, because at first instance, they have to sit as judge and jury. They have to try to investigate this noise complaint and try to make a determination as to whether or not it constitutes a nuisance. Is it a breach of the bylaws? And that can be a very difficult exercise.
Right. And some people are pretty passionate in explaining their situations, and I'm beset upon, and here's my evidence. And these people aren't trained in any of this activity at all. They're volunteers, as Tony keeps saying. So obviously, this had gone to the Strata Council, Stephen. All of the protocols were followed. The Strata Council first, they would have had some attempt at that level to deal with it, but eventually, and this happens to a lot because you go to court a lot, eventually it ended up at trial.
Well, eventually the council, I think, did as much as it could do. It had hired, it appears, an acoustical engineer or a consultant to make some recommendations about what could be done to lessen the noise coming from the piano, and that just continued to it didn't satisfy the owner beside the piano-playing neighbors.
Well, Tony's about to quote us chapter and verse here because he's got the Strata Property Act in his binder open. Is this as common as Stephen would have us believe in terms of nuisance complaints and just inability of people to get along with each other?
Well, it is common, and nuisance comes in just so many varieties. It's not just about noise.
Right.
It's about use of property in any way that essentially unreasonably disrupts another person's use of the property. It's common property, limited common property, or their strata lot. So we talk about noise being a very common thing, and that comes in just so many factors, right? Loud stereos, even people vacuuming at 3 o'clock in the morning, doing their laundry at 3 in the morning. Noise just has so many variables to it. Kids playing outside. where you have townhouse complexes or apartment complexes with children's play areas. What is reasonable noise? What is a reasonable period of time that noise can be made without disruption of other stratalots? It's difficult to actually put your finger on it sometimes, because what is reasonable to one person may not necessarily be reasonable to another person.
But in the case of this piano-playing teenager, Stephen, the judge did find in favor of the piano player and his family, because they had at least made efforts to communicate with the people who were the aggrieved party and to make some remedies, to attempt some remedies. And so there was effort on the part of the offender to not be perceived as being egregious.
That was certainly part of it. The other part of it seemed to be the judge's concern that the evidence before him wasn't enough to prove the nuisance. He had made a comment that there was no study before him from an acoustical engineer to objectively measure the level of noise coming from one unit to the other.
Right.
There were no recordings of the piano playing so that the judge could evaluate the level of noise and the frequency of it. So, I mean, obviously, if you're going to go to court with those kind of cases, this is a good example of what kind of evidence you will need to bring to the court in order to prove your case. It won't be enough simply to say it is affecting me. You'd better come to court with some more objective evidence.
Okay. Yeah. And what other sorts of nuisance cases dominate your to-do list on a daily basis?
Well, it's a broad range, but one of the more interesting and challenging nuisance kinds of cases out there right now relates to the mixed-use buildings, where you have residential stratalots above commercial stratalots.
Oh, sure, okay.
And one area that's causing all kinds of mischief right now in the Lower Mainland in particular, and maybe perhaps mostly in the Vancouver area, is where you have these exercise facilities below a residential community above them, and
right.
they're having Zumba classes and running on treadmills and hooting and hollering, and
right.
and at the end of the day, it's very difficult to balance the interests of a commercial business that has a license to operate and balance that with the interests of the owners above them that are trying to enjoy the use of their property.
Right.
And unfortunately, those blends of uses don't rest easily with each other, and I don't know how the court will ultimately sort out those issues if they go to court, and they may very well go to court because they are becoming more and more of a challenge for communities.
But also by way of spending another moment paying attention to potential first-time strata buyers and condo dwellers. Again, make a lot of time, set aside a lot of time to do the homework, Tony, so that if you are going to move into a strata environment out of that suburban single-family home, you don't end up on top of a fitness club going, gosh, it's loud here and it's kind of late at night. Again, you go into these things with your eyes wide open, hopefully.
Well, in first-time buyers, I think, get into a false sense of security about what, especially in new buildings, about what the building's intended to be used for. Because you'll look at a disclosure statement that the developer has to give you as a first-time buyer.
Right.
And it will say things in it like that the commercial area is intended to be used for retail, for medical, dental, and a variety of things, but you need to read closely. It may be intended for that, but it's not limited to that.
Oh.
It could be anything potentially. Could be a pizza parlor. Mm-hmm. Could be a restaurant with ovens and exhaust vents and whatnot. Sometimes these are building design issues that need to be remedied. Sometimes you may have a rooftop area that has exhaust fans from restaurants that are exhausting adjacent to where the residential units are.
That's true.
And there need to be some modifications. And those are solutions. It's nice when those things occur because those are solutions that really just take some money and modification to fix them.
And Stephen, again, nodding vigorously in agreement. That does happen where the commercial component of a strata and the residents of the residential part, there are some conflicts because, well, commercial people are trying to make a buck and the residents are just trying to have a nice quiet life.
Exactly. Exactly. And for commercial owners, you talk to them when you're trying to deal with these issues, and they're saying we are trying to make a buck. We're doing our best not to be noisy or create odors that are offensive. But, this is the kind of business we're allowed to operate within this community. So we think we're doing things within the letter of the law, and they can only do so much. And often it's not enough for the people living in the residential part of the building.
In those buildings, Tony, when you've got a few floors of commercial and many floors of residential, who forms the strata council for that building? Or do they have two, one for the commercial bottom half and another one for the residential top half?
Well, it's a little bit of a mystery, actually, because you don't know unless you look at how the properties are designated. You look at the bylaws to see whether sections have been created within the corporation, right? Which gives some autonomy to each of the commercial and the residential divisions, but not entirely. You're still a strata. If you're in a single building that is one strata corporation, you function entirely as a general strata does. In addition, you may create independent commercial and residential sections where the business of exclusive just to those sections is administered by those sections.
Okay.
Right? And there could be some exclusive expenses. The residential units are the only ones who use the elevator. They pay for the elevator cost, right? So you can have you have the ability of exclusive allocation, but if you're doing that, you really have three functioning strata corporations in a lot of ways. You have the corporation that represents all of the property, the interest of all the liability. You have the insurance that represents the property, the general repairs of the property.
Sure.
And then you will have each separate section, which is like a small strata corporation within the strata corporation who administers their own exclusive expenses. But it's more complicated than that today, because now we have what we commonly start seeing as airspace parcel agreements. And what airspace parcel agreements are, they are a boundary property line dividing horizontally one property from another. So as opposed to having a property next to each other, these are properties above each other. And there may be no connection to these properties whatsoever, other than the fact that they have an agreement about how they will share some of the related expenses that they have and some of the related liabilities. They're totally separate properties. And that's actually much more common now.
Stephen is enjoying how confused I've become in the last 30 seconds. That's a new one on me, the airspace agreement. Is this all new legal language as well?
No, it's certainly been around for some time, but you're starting to see more of it as densities increase in the Lower Mainland. It's a convenient way to be able to build another community in a bubble in the sky, right? And so it just allows communities to increase densities.
Well, and you can have 3, 4, or 5 airspace parcel agreements on top of each other. So we've stacked essentially 5 properties on top of each other. And we have all of these agreements. This is where the devil's in the details.
Right, of course.
The strata councils of each of those strata corporations need to get a copy of those published agreements. I doubt they will understand most of them. They need legal advice on how to interpret them and understand them. But they have a huge impact on future costs.
Right. And for strata councils, by the way, looking for just a little bit of a clue, if I'm confused, imagine how a lot of these volunteers in StrataCorp, they must be equally confused, if not more so.
Absolutely.
And one terrific resource for strata councils right across British Columbia is the website of Tony's organization, the Condominium Homeowners Association of BC, or CHOA, CHOA for short. Their website is choa.bc.ca. It is a fabulous resource for condo owners and strata councils alike. Have a look. We'll take a quick break and come right back. This is Key Pacific's Talk About Strata.
Delivering relevant and beneficial consumer information. This is Experts on Call. And there's more still ahead on AM 650.